Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. From the King Edward Hotel in downtown Toronto, welcome to the Empire Club of Canada. For those of you joining us by webcast or podcast, welcome to the meeting. We finally have a chance to get into the real story of Meghan and Harry. After 3 years of debate and a couple of elections, Brexit finally happened. At midnight on January 31st, the United Kingdom formally split from Europe. Now begins an intensive 11-month period of negotiations. Both sides must determine what their future relationship will look like across a range of issues from law enforcement to aviation standards to fishing waters, and the list goes on and on. And in the midst of all this negotiating, Canada has emerged as an important reference for what the future could include for Britain, thanks to our Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, or CETA, with Europe. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said explicitly that he wants a free trade agreement that is similar to Canada's. Our guest today is as close to an expert on the British as the British government is likely to find. Andrew Percy is the Conservative MP for Brigg and Goole, and for both Prime Ministers David Cameron and Theresa May, he served as the trade envoy to Canada. Since his election in 2010, he has also served in Cabinet as Parliamentary Undersecretary and Minister for Local Growth. You may recognize him from his appearances on CBC's Power and Politics, where he's been sharing his insights on Brexit and British politics with Canadians for some time. We're delighted he's able to join us today to do the same. So please welcome to our stage, Andrew Percy. Joining Andrew today is Donna Skelly, the MPP for Flamborough, Glanbrook. Donna is the Parliamentary Assistant to the Minister of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade. Like Andrew, you may also recognize her from TV. She is a 30-year veteran of broadcast news and a former anchor on CHCH. We're thrilled she's agreed to moderate today's discussion. Please welcome Donna.
There we go. Hello, everyone. I have a feeling that there will be a lot of questions for Andrew, but before we get to that, we will be passing the microphone around, so if you would like to ask Andrew some questions about Brexit or anything else in his life, about Harry, about the Queen, about anything, you'll have your opportunity. But before we get that, Andrew, you have a lot of, obviously a lot of experience and perhaps some background information you can share with us about what really happened with Brexit, and what brought us to this point.
Well, first of all, good afternoon. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Mike, for inviting me to the Empire Club. I was shocked to find that the Empire Club has somebody with the title president in it, so we might have to change that at some point in the future. But it's a real privilege to be here. You have had a range of very good speakers over the year, including, I believe, Winston Churchill. So I want to be the sort of Neville Chamberlain today to Winston Churchill. But anyway, look, it's great to be here. And I thought I'd just perhaps, in answering that, Donna, say a little something about why we got to Brexit in the first place. Because one of the most frustrating things for the last couple of years when you go overseas to talk about what happened with Brexit is having people tell me and tell my constituents why it is they voted to leave the European Union. And we've had this, of course, in the UK. So we repeatedly get told by, if anybody reads The Guardian or if anybody follows the BBC very closely on this subject, they might have a slightly different perspective for why we voted to leave the European Union. And often that is termed in that, the vote to leave the European Union was a bunch of working class, old white people from the north of England who voted to leave because they're a little bit racist. And that is a mantra which has been repeated back to me very often, but it's actually much more complex than that. This was a 40-year relationship that for a lot of people in the UK never sat very comfortably with the UK's position as a country within Europe, but not, I think it was Churchill who said, we're with Europe, but not of it. So we've just had a very different perspective on what European integration should look like. So my constituency is in the north of England. 70% of my constituents voted to leave the European Union. They didn't vote to leave the European Union because they want to reject people from different countries or because they're anti-immigration. They voted to leave because of very genuine concerns about how we are governed as a country, about sovereignty, particularly over things like fishing rights, which was a big issue in my constituency, used to be a very big industry, over the cost of the European Union vis-a-vis their own lives. So people would see that their own lives weren't getting any better, but they're seeing that we're spending billions of pounds paying for infrastructure projects elsewhere in Europe. And then, of course, immigration was an element. So the deep dive polling bears this out, that people voted to leave the European Union principally on the issue of sovereignty. It was not on the issue of immigration. It was sovereignty and it was the cost. And that's quite different to what you sometimes get told. And it's been, the last 2 years have been, you may have seen, it's been quite unpleasant in the UK, with Parliament being unable to get anything done. And that has divided the country very strongly to the point where a lot of my constituents feel they've been repeatedly insulted because they've been misinterpreted for why we voted. And I'll just end, I know I'm going on a bit, but I think it's important to understand the context of this, is that even when we talk about the issue of immigration, we have to remember that the experience of somebody with unlimited, remember what immigration is from the European Union, free movement means. It is an unlimited right of people to move from 27 other countries into the United Kingdom, as we have into their countries too, and without a job, in a very short period of time, full access to the UK benefit system, UK health system, having never paid in potentially. And as I say, these are reciprocal rights. We have them in other countries too. But that is a free movement right that this country doesn't have, a country that's very open to immigration in this country doesn't have with any other country on the planet. And that has meant that in a low-paid area such as mine, the experience of inward immigration from the European Union has been very different, Donna, perhaps, to what the experience has been for a banker or somebody working in financial services in London. It has meant largely unskilled workers coming from Eastern Europe, worked very hard, made an incredible contribution to the local economy and the national economy. But there have been consequences of that for people in areas such as mine who don't have the advantages of being able to go off and get a job in the city in London or a high-paid job in law or say, financial services. There has been consequences to that in terms of flatlining of wages and people's feelings about their community and about their life chances. So the experience of that unlimited migration, which has generally been positive for the country in many ways, is very different depending on where you are in the country. And that's why voters in the north of England voted the way they did. It wasn't just some knee-jerk Trumpian reaction to people coming from overseas. Sorry, long answer, but I thought it's just important to lay out the context for why people might have voted to leave.
Has there been any impact yet from this decision, which is almost 2 months old?
Well, I mean, if you mean economic impacts, look, the UK, we were told, I mean, you're going to get a very Brexit-y perspective on things. I'm not going to apologise for that. I'm not going to pretend to be even in the slightest give the Remain side of the argument one little bit of attention. But the Remain campaign did say one of their key campaign lines in the referendum was that leaving the European Union would result in an immediate shock to the UK economy, voting to leave, not actually leaving, which would cost up to 1 million jobs and the economy would go into an immediate recession. Well, that hasn't happened. Unemployment's at a 40-year low. We have an unemployment rate of 3.1%, which is technically, functionally, it's full employment. And the economy has continued to grow in line with or above the EU average. But look, there are people in this room who will know better than I. There have been investment decisions that have not been made because of our inability to, frankly, get our act together over the last couple of years as a parliament and as a government. So there has been a choking effect, but there has not been a rapid decline in terms of, wage growth is the fastest it's been for 10 years in the UK at the moment. So the economy maybe hasn't powered ahead as fast as it could have done, but all the dire predictions about what would happen have not come to pass. There is the slight proviso I'd put on that, of course, is that although we've left the European Union, we're still technically a member. We're not technically a member at all, that's nonsense. But we're following all of the rules, and we're still in the single market, the customs union, until the end of December. So there is a potential at that point for much more disruption to trade flows.
You have a year, or almost a year, to hammer out a deal with the union. And currently, if you're unable to reach that, walk us through the timeline and take us to, and one of the reasons we're here today is the process involved in working with Canada and in particular businesses in Ontario.
I feel like we're on daytime telly. I think we've
We could have our own
we've got
show.
the looks for it. I think we could do it. So we're in this transition period. The government has laid out the big thing that has changed in the last few months is the election victory in December, which for anybody involved, and there are people in this room involved in politics, was a masterclass in how to deliver a very simple message of get Brexit done. If anybody saw the Prime Minister's Love Actually spoof election, it was it was brilliant. And it was, all of I'm part of the red wall. I won my seat off Labour in 2010, but I was mainly surrounded by this red wall, which are the Labour seats that fell. And I spent the whole of my election campaign basically in those seats. And, it was incredible just within a couple of weeks of that campaign, knocking on the doors of people who have voted Labour their whole lives, never really been engaged in politics. And they say, well, you know what we've got to do? We've just got to get Brexit done. And you heard that from people who voted Leave and who voted Remain. And that's been the really big change, is that obviously we've delivered this majority. Where the Conservative Party's vote base comes from has shifted considerably. We are a much more northern working class party than we've ever been, even compared to the Thatcher years, and Thatcher did very well in those communities. So what that means for the timeline is that we have legislated, because the government will now get, and this is the big change compared to the last 2 years where the government hasn't been able to get Parliament to agree anything, the government will get what it wants through Parliament now. We have a majority of 80, a working majority of 87 if you take the Shinners out. So we are going to get through whatever, the Prime Minister will get through what he wants. So that means we're on this timeline to the end of December. We're in this transition period. The Prime Minister, in the negotiating mandate he's issued to our negotiators, is seeking a Canada-style trade agreement with the EU. So that is no dynamic alignment, no role for the European Court. That is a pure free trade agreement based on the principle, and the number one principle of this government is sovereignty. So there will be no role for the European Court and no role for EU rules to be automatically implemented. That's a considerable shift away from where Theresa May had us. That will be a challenging timeline. The EU is already adding in other things like the return of the Elgin marbles to Greece, but they're going nowhere. And they have already said that there will be, of course, this is a very challenging timeline. All I would say is if you look at the history of any EU negotiation, be it Maastricht Treaty, be it Amsterdam, they always say this, and everything's always very challenging. But the clear mandate the Prime Minister has issued is a free trade agreement only. So that is going to be a major, major change in the trade relationship between the UK and the EU. And he will get that because Parliament will not stand in the way.
You mentioned earlier that there was free access, free movement of workers, obviously, as a member of the European Union. One of the big issues in Ontario, and probably right across Canada, is the lack of workers, skilled and otherwise. Are you concerned about that?
Yes, and I'm conscious this is on camera, and so I'll be careful about what I say about the proposed system where we are going to introduce. So we are going to introduce a points-based immigration system, based on the Australian/Canadian model. So if you have a PhD, you'll definitely get in. We've been quite clear about that. But the proposed system is a very strict system in terms of lower skilled workers. And I don't like using the phrase lower skilled workers, because if you're working in the care sector and if you're working in a factory, you're doing really important jobs just as anybody else. But that, so just for the purposes of how we understand it in immigration terms. But there will be no route in on lower skilled stuff, with some exceptions around the NHS and around seasonal agricultural workers. And now that there is... So if I'm being honest about that, I'm not sure that's going to serve the best interests of the economy in the short term. But you have to remember that a big mandate of this government is proving that it has left the European Union to those communities that voted Conservative for the first time. And a way of doing that is through a relatively tough, but what the government would argue fair, new points-based system. So it will mirror some of the Canadian model, but there aren't proposals for regional pilots, there are some exceptions for agricultural workers, but it's going to be a relatively tough immigration system based around addressing skill shortages, as yours does here. But I think, if I'm being honest, I think it probably needs some more work to ensure that it aligns with the needs of the economy. Because as I say, we've got 3.1% unemployment and big skill shortages in certain areas. So.
Having left the European Union, we do have to enter into a new trade agreement with Canada. Are there opportunities? Is this an opportunity?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the UK was one of the biggest advocates for CETA within the European Union. And obviously we were pretty peeved off when the Walloonians got themselves involved at the end. But we'll have no such concern with Wallonia on a UK-Canada deal. So we were big advocates for CETA, and there are huge opportunities. Actually, if anything, I think CETA didn't really go far enough for what we want to achieve and could achieve. So, obviously the UK is an economy largely based on services. Services were pretty much written out of CETA, or there were some provisions for further down the line. So there is a lot more we can do, but that will take be diplomatic about it. It's important people in this room are lobbying the Canadian government to come to the table on that. We've just issued our new proposed tariff schedules. I think that might serve as a spur to encourage Canada to come to the table. But look, the Prime Minister, the government, again, this is a big difference from Brexit to Trump, because the other thing you see written in North America is that Brexit is just the British version of Trump. Well, in some respects, you might argue some of the motivations among some of the voters are, but actually the government's response to this and the people who led the Leave campaign, be it Johnson, Michael Gove and others, etc., did so on the basis of Britain needs to be a free trading champion. So the new tariffs we have proposed will actually be lower tariffs than are currently charged by the European Union external tariff. So there is going to be no retreat into Trumpian tariffs and protectionism. We're absolutely clear that the new trading regime we're going to put in place is one that is rooted in free trade. Again, a big difference from the whole stuff happening to the south of your border. But specifically on Canada, the government's very clear it wants trade agreements, talking up very much at the moment Australia, Japan, the US, and Canada, of course, is one of our biggest partners we would want to do that with. But it will take both governments to be keen to get round the table. So I would urge people to lobby their MPs and MPPs to make sure Canada comes to the table on that, because we really want to do one. And there is so much, same legal system, we speak at least one shared language, similar institutions, same business practices. There is so much more beyond the CETA treaty that we can and should be doing.
Let's look a little bit down the road, perhaps 2 or 3 years in the future. What do you see happening with the European Union?
So there are people who are on the Brexit wing of my party and of the debate, like me, who wish the European Union nothing but ill. And I don't share that, because the European Union is actually a fantastic creation for the continent of Europe, rooted out of... and again, this is the psychology of how Brits have thought about Europe to the rest of Europe is rooted in history. With the UK having not been successfully invaded for 1,000 years, that motivation to European political integration that you have in Europe born out of the necessity of avoiding war and conflict and shifting borders doesn't exist in the UK in the same way. So I am of the view that all I want is the European Union to be successful. It's our biggest trading partner, our closest ally, and it should continue to be so. So I wish the European Union well. How they respond to the decision of us to leave is, of course, a matter for them, and we'll know more as these trade discussions go on. But I don't think we'll see any other exits. There was talks of Frexits and Nexits. The French and the Netherlands. I don't think none of that will happen, and nor do I think it should happen. I think the UK is the only country in the European Union that traded more outside of the EU than within the EU. So I think our position has never been a comfortable one within, because we've never really been signed up as a people to the political elements of union. I don't want 2/3 of my laws set in Brussels. You wouldn't want 2/3 of your laws set in Washington. I suspect there are people in Ontario who don't want 2/3 of their laws set in Toronto or Ottawa. But that motivation is very different in Europe for very different reasons. But I think the EU will continue to prosper, and I wish it well.
How are young people looking at this decision to leave? Do they see it as do they see hope, or are they concerned about the decision to leave the European Union?
Well, some people have lost their heads a bit. We've not left humanity behind, as some on the Remain side. You look at some of the marches in the streets that there were by the anti-Brexit groups. And look, young people, voted in large numbers to remain in the EU, those that turned out to vote. In an area like mine, it was probably more mixed, but certainly younger voters voted to stay in the European Union. And that's often used by the Remain side. I mean, we don't put 18-year-olds in charge of our nuclear submarines, but apparently they know better whether we should be in the European Union than a 60-year-old or a 50-year-old. So they have been weaponized a bit by the Remain side. But there's no doubt young people voted by a large margin, those that voted, to stay in. But a significant number, didn't vote at all. And it's a way, I think one of the challenges for those of us on the Brexit side is trying to prove to young people that Brexit is a progressive thing. It's not a regressive return to, I don't say the word, but return to empire. It's not about, sailing off with our Union Jack underpants into the mid-Atlantic and, wanting to plant the Union Jack everywhere again. It's not about that. I see it as a very progressive thing of saying, we can be a free trade champion on the world stage again, champion the principles that Britain has given to so much of the world, of the rule of law, of democracy, and of a fair go. And a lot of young people don't see that at the moment. But as I say, a lot of them didn't vote either.
You spend a lot of time in Canada.
I do, but don't tell my constituents that. Can we cut that?
And you like Canada?
I do, it's lovely.
And what do you see as opportunities here and our strengths? We live in the bubble, especially when you're in politics. You tend to surround yourself with like-minded people, but coming in as a foreigner, what are our assets and our strengths?
I think if you called me honorary Canadian would be better than foreigner. No, I spent a lot of time here. I worked in Vancouver years ago. I come back, a few times a year. For short trips, just in case any of my constituents find out. Look, the country's a great country, but the advantage Canada has in the context of where the UK is heading is that, when my role as the trade envoy for 2 and a bit years, talking to businesses who've come to Canada, they find setting up business here, coming and living here to be relatively easy. In fact, I had one of my constituents, he set up a company in the UK, brought it over here to Toronto, and the company's based in Yorkshire. He moved it to, had offices open in Birmingham, and he actually said to me, setting up in Toronto was easier than when he tried to set up in Birmingham, because Birmingham was more different to somewhere else in England, and he found Canada. So this is a great place to do business for Brits. But so Canada has a great role in being that bridge between North America and Europe more generally, but certainly the UK, which is why I am excited about what we can do together. What we do together is, although the history is important, that's relatively unimportant in this context. It's about where do we both see ourselves as nations in the 21st century. We're both countries that have changed rapidly in the last couple of decades. If you look at the makeup of our countries demographically, the UK is adding about 500,000, about 600,000 new people a year. Net, that's about 450,000. So the country has changed. The values of this country and our country are both progressive values. So there is, I think Canada has a unique position because it's also a big trading partner in a way that other English-speaking countries such as Australia and New Zealand aren't particularly. So I think, Canada, not just as a bridge to the UK, but particularly at the moment because we will be talking to each other face-to-face on trade for the first time in 40-odd years, but actually as a bridge to Europe through to the US, and because people are very nervous about the US at the moment because of some of the interesting things that are happening down in the US. I just think Canada's in a great position.
Before we get to the audience that may have some questions, we have to ask you about the royal family.
Oh, right, your royal family, they're not
We
mine.
now call him Harry, I understand. Our royal family, our member is out in Vancouver. How is that actually playing out? How do people feel in England about Harry and Meghan moving to...
It's all Meghan's fault. That's what someone told me. That's what
Her father is certainly saying that.
That's what a constituent told me the other day. Look, to be honest, it's... the Brits have that weird fascination, and it's fascination mixed with a strong dose of disinterest in the royal family. So we're fascinated by them, but at the same time quite disinterested. And it's that weird, contradiction in most people in the UK is we like having the royals, but and we like to follow them in the Daily Mail and all the rest of it, but we're also a bit disinterested in them. So most people aren't that bothered. I think it's more that, look, it's a soap opera, isn't it, the whole thing, and I think people just don't really understand. I mean, how do you guys feel? They're going to be living here, so...
Well, they are living here.
So, yeah, on Vancouver Island. So...
Well, he's just a common guy now.
He just wants to be, yes, just the common guy whose grandmother happens to be the Queen. That's a really normal chap. But no, I think, I mean, look, my friends have the same story to tell. No, I mean, look, good luck to them. I think it's sad that we've ended up in the position we're in, but I think most Brits just don't really understand. I mean, I understand why they want to move to BC. Ontario would have been a great choice as well, just to be clear.
Absolutely.
But not
much better government.
Yeah, well, that's true, yes. But yeah, I think it's good. At least it will strengthen our ties a bit more.
So, do we have any questions? There's a gentleman over here.
Can you make them easy, please? I like easy questions.
This could be easy or it could be hard. I don't know. Benjamin Sharma. I am involved somewhat in conservative politics here. I did want to ask, and just first to start, I think the world has missed having a free trade favoring great power since the Ottawa Conference of 1932 and the abandonment of free trade. But in many ways, Canada and the United Kingdom do not consider each other foreign. We split embassies. We have the same head of state. The UK has a tendency to hire Canadians without British citizenship to run big departments and institutions like the Bank of England, the Royal Mail, the Ombudsman, and the Australians do the same thing for army officers and such from here. You may have heard of a movement called CANZIC, with the acronym Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, for much easier movement between our four countries in much the same way as there's movement between Australia and New Zealand. And I know it's a little early to talk about stuff like this, but speaking as an honorary Canadian and a fellow subject of Her Majesty, I suppose, what do you think?
Well, first of all, of course, we still let Canadians vote in UK elections if they're living in the UK. So the qualification for standing for Parliament in the UK is you have to be a British, Irish, or Commonwealth citizen. So you're all welcome to come and stand in Brigg and Goole, but you will be beasted by me. My machine is quite a sight to see. But give it a go anyway. You'll be most welcome. So we, and of course, in law, Commonwealth citizens in the UK are not foreign in law. So yes, we have all of those. So I understand the motivation behind the movement. I've met with them several times before. I think the challenge we have with that is, so I think freer movement within trade treaties, as there are in the CETA provisions, as you have in NAFTA or whatever it's called now, things we should be seeking to pursue. I think they're better to be pursued bilaterally rather than through some Canada, Australia, New Zealand kind of agreement. And I think the challenge for that is to sell that. First of all, I don't think you'd sell that in Canada, because I think there would be people from one province in particular who might, because of the controls they have over their own immigration policy, might have a very strong opinion about this preferment for the UK. I don't know, but you speak better to that. I think it's a hard sell in the UK in the sense of, not that it's a hard sell to Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, but to say, oh, look, we've just left the European Union because of all these concerns about free movement. But look, turns out we want to do a load of free movement with all these English-speaking people, so maybe it was a little bit of xenophobia. So I think it's a hard sell in the UK at the moment. There'd be strong support for it amongst the public, but I think on a policy level, it's difficult. So I think we should be encouraged. So the first thing we should be doing is we should be making and increasing the number of people who can travel on young persons visas for this 2-year visas that we give to Australia, Canadians, and New Zealanders. We should be doing that. We should be seeking for intercompany transfers, independent professionals, and all the rest of it, freer movement, but we have to negotiate that bilaterally. So I support the aims of CANZOC, but I just think it's not achievable, because I think it's also a hard sell in New Zealand, and Australia potentially because of what it looks like and what it says in terms of regressive return to empire thing. So I think we can achieve it, but we can achieve it bilaterally in just the same way. But I think having the campaign argue for it is still a good thing.
Any other questions? And then there was a gentleman up. Yes.
Hi. Kent Emerson, past president of the Empire Club. You spoke about sort of the disadvantage of the Brexit in terms of the skilled trade aspect. What would you say, what would be your list, other than sovereignty, of the advantages of Brexit, both for the country but I'm thinking about the small shop owners, other companies, like if there's a hit in the short term, what's the long-term picture in your view, like in terms of the list of what you think someone would be saying about Brexit 10 years from now?
Right, well, I mean, what I hope people will be saying is first of all, what are the advantages? So, I would argue that the advantage of setting your own laws is quite a substantial one, and having an independent trade policy, we'll be an independent coastal nation again, with full rights over our own fishing grounds again. But actually setting our own trade policy is really important because the EU, although I wish the EU well, the one thing the EU has been, and people forget this, because, the EU gets presented as this progressive blah, blah, blah because of all the free movement within and free trade within. But it is a very, very insular institution in terms of what it keeps out. So it is a protectionist trading bloc in so many different ways, which is why the only continent that's been growing more slowly than Europe in the last few years has been Antarctica economically. And I'm told there are unique and specific reasons which prevent Antarctica growing as strongly as it could otherwise, i.e. no people. But I think they've got penguins, or is that the Arctic? I can't remember. It's just all ice. So the argument for those who are Brexiteers is that the European Union has served as a choke on, and particularly a choke on the UK because of the regulatory burdens. Not that we're going to rip those up, because there's no desire to rip a lot of that up, and a lot of it is international stuff anyway. But just in terms of what it does to keep out trade from other parts of the world. So the advantage for us is, as a country that trades more outside, is first of all, look at what we're proposing to do on external tariffs for, which are going to be below those of the European Union. So I think that's a really big advantage for us. The economy is structured very differently in the UK because it's so service-based. So that's very different. So we'll have new freedoms around that. But I think it's that ability for us to go out and be a free trading advocate, as I say, which is already, despite having been in the European Union, manages to trade more outside than inside the EU. So look, that freedom to determine some of our own regulations as we move forward is a really important one, particularly as the world's becoming more competitive. The European Union has not been good at reading and responding to the challenges of of where the growth in the world is now. It hasn't been, and that's why our growth rates have, across the continent of Europe have been pretty low for the last decade or so. So I think those freedoms will give us that. So in 10 years' time, I think people will say, look, the EU still there, it's doing okay, but the UK charted its own course. It went through to its natural path, which is trading partners as part of. I mean, the government's vision is of a global Britain. That's the whole strategy, and that we'll all sit much more comfortably. So we'll sit much more comfortably as a partner with Europe, and they'll sit much more comfortably with us, because it's been a very uncomfortable relationship for 40 years.
Yes.
Hi, Ken Peel. A question dealing with the concern or expression of sovereignty as to whether that also includes provision, for example, in procurement of Buy Britain restrictions or restrictions to local providers. If so, what are the implications for a proposed kind of no-hold free trade agreement with Canada? And if not a restricted procurement process, would you not find that the suppliers would tend to go to larger market, for example, EU technical standards and sourcing?
Yep. So we've been really, really clear that we are not going to follow EU state aid rules and procurement rules any longer. But we've also been really clear in the, and this is, more of this will be laid out, the Prime Minister, I think, today has just laid out some more detail to our negotiating position. But we've also been very clear that what we don't seek to be is some kind of Singapore on the edge of Europe that's going to rapidly rip up standards or anything like that. And we're going to be very sensible when it comes to state aid rules and procurement rules because we understand the importance of the integration we do have with Europe more generally. So we're not going to follow, we absolutely will not be following EU procurement rules, and we want flexibilities and provisions to enable us to procure more UK content. We've actually argued for that and secured some changes to EU procurement rules already, which allow us to take into account social factors. And the UK was the principal member state to push those. So we want more freedoms to do that, but we're not proposing to have a system which goes against, because that of course rubs up against the principles of free trade. So we will require in the deal we do with the EU more freedoms around that. But when, as I say, there's no way in which the UK is going to rip up all these and head off in some completely different direction where by British provisions and all the rest of it, or on state aid. But we require greater freedoms than we have at the moment.
And unfortunately, that is all the time we have for our questions. But I'd like to thank you.
No, thank
You're
you.
an absolute delight. The wealth of information that you've brought with you today, and it's been very entertaining and very informative. And I'm sure the Empire Club will be honored to have you back as a guest.
Oh, well, good. Well, thank you. Well, thank you for having me. I've appreciated the questions, so thank you. Thank you. So, it's good. Thank you.
I'm just going to ask Bliss Baker from Maple Leaf Strategies to properly express appreciation.
Right. On behalf of the Empire Club, Andrew, we'd like to thank you for making the trip across the pond to be with us today. We certainly, I think I can speak for everyone here, we appreciated your candor and insights and your cheeky sense of humor. So on behalf of the Empire Club, thank you very much.
In closing, let me just say that we have a couple events coming up. One I'd like to highlight for you. We have Vickery Bowles. She's the chief librarian of the Toronto Public Library. She stood up in, I think, a very brave way around free speech in the fall. It's a chance for her to tell her story. We have the Minister of Finance from the Ontario government coming on March 10th as well. That was just announced this morning. So please look those up on our website. Thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned.